Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. And today we're back with another Beatles reaction video. And we are now on to the White Album. So I realize this is not the original cover. The original cover is just white with the word The Beatles. I think the official title of the album is The Beatles, not the White Album. But I think that flagrant minimalism, especially with the band that invented the idea of album art, bothered people so much. So usually I find the public library kind of ruins album covers. You know, the albums get damaged, so they just put in a black and white insert. But this time they're like, you know what, we can't stand the minimalism, so it looks like they inserted this version with like these minimal pictures of the Beatles on top, so they weren't literally just renting out a disc that was plain white on the cover. But anyway, let's get into talking about those songs on the White Album. So this one starts off with a classic. So of course I've heard this one before. It's called Back in the USSR. And one of the things I appreciate in the song is the challenge of writing something that is an original song while very clearly referencing other songs. So this was a rewrite of Chuck Berry's Back in the USA, as well as incorporating elements from the Beach Boys, and Mike Love of the Beach Boys supposedly encouraged Paul McCartney to do this. So this meant like little changes, like having some parts in a quasi-minor key, and then adding in the sound of plane travel in the background. One could read various things out of the politics of the song. Mostly it's just a silly substitution of Back in the USA with Back in the USSR. So you could read it as a critique of the American patriotism of Chuck Berry. But then again, Chuck Berry was a black man in America, and he wasn't, you know, ignorant of the consequences of that. So Back in the USSR isn't necessarily a Republican rah-rah patriotism song. So it wasn't necessarily a song that had to be protested. And so, in fairness, Back in the USSR, it's not like going hard in the other direction. You could read some things that are a bit critical of the USSR in there, with the honey disconnect the phone lyric. But overall, the perception of it at the time was that it normalized the USSR. You know, even if it was kind of silly to say, those Ukraine girls really knocked me out, as if they were California girls. At the end of the day, it was just a really easygoing song about the USSR, and I think that pissed off some of the conservatives in Western society at the time. The second song on the album is called Dear Prudence, and this is one I've never paid much attention to, just because, you know, there are so many classic Beatles songs, and so by the time someone gets to recommending Dear Prudence, I'm like, yeah, whatever. But it's actually quite a compelling song, and it's mostly because of the guitar production. The lyrics just sound like a little nursery rhyme, but there's just that perfect amount of echo on the guitars that it creates this memorable, echoey, psychedelic little playground, even as the Beatles are starting to move out of their psychedelic period. Third on the album is Glass Onion. So I'd only heard a tiny snippet of Glass Onion as a sort of transition piece on the Beatles' Greatest Hits Love album, which involves some remixing of the songs a little. So this one was really misrepresented on that compilation album. I thought it was just like a weird little bit of sound, but it's actually a real rocker. And essentially it's just a sort of rehashing of a little bit Strawberry Fields and mostly of I Am the Walrus, of John just sort of saying psychedelic things for the heck of it, and mostly to troll people who are trying to find too much meaning in popular music, though this time he's making it a bit more explicit. The most memorable line is when he declares the walrus is Paul, because of course I Am the Walrus is sung by John Lennon, and this helped fuel the Paul actually died in 1967 or 66, whenever it was, conspiracy, because I don't know why, but proclaiming that the walrus is Paul somehow implied that the real Paul wasn't there anymore. Track 4 is called Oobla Dee Oobla Da. It's a catchy reggae-inspired tune. This was really a Paul idea, and I think it's great because on the one hand, it's a very simple song. The earworm gets in your head right away, but the production is actually quite complicated. And then there's a bridge, and so once you think it's just a simple again and again, you like the repetition song, it actually shows, no, Paul put a lot of thought into the composition of this one. Unfortunately, the other Beatles didn't really like this one. I mean, John saw it as kind of corny. He called it one of Paul's granny songs. That's a term I'm going to use several times over the course of this review. And Paul was also apparently very perfectionist with the recording of this one, so I think that managed to alienate George and Ringo as well. And there was a period when Ringo didn't even want to be in the Beatles in this recording session. I think it was because of Paul proclaiming that he was in fact the best drummer in the Beatles, so I might be getting some of my history confused there. The next song in the album is Wild Honey Pie. This is a real weird one. It's basically just a mix of sound effects, and sometimes I assume it's weirder, fancier things, but at times it's just a mixing of guitar strings being plucked and drums being hit to create a real bouncy sound. It's weird, but it's short. It's quite enjoyable, even for someone like me who mostly likes songs to stick to a more standard formula. Track 6 is called The Continuing Story of Bungalow Bill. Something about the opening melody sounded very familiar to me, and supposedly it comes from a song, Stay As Sweet As You Are, though I feel like, hey, na 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 na, it reminds me of something else as well. I don't know, I'll have to let you know in a later video. And it's sort of a combination between cartoonishness and seriousness. It was inspired by someone who shot a tiger when the Beatles were in India, and I guess on the one hand, you know, John is sort of going into his hardcore militant hippie mode and really doesn't like the idea of, you know, macho Westerner going to foreign countries and killing animals that they really don't need to kill. But, you know, he also has to live with this person, so he's kind of being kind of cartoonish about it, kind of cheeky in the way that the Beatles have been for a while. Track number 7 is another real stunner. It's While My Guitar Gently Weeps. So Eric Clapton played the guitar solo on it, and just looking at the Wikipedia, it says that Eric Clapton was hesitant. It's like, well, this is a Beatles project. Isn't the Beatles specifically U4? And George sort of said, no, this is my song. This is not really the Beatles. So I suppose you could say this is the beginning of George's breakaway into what would be a great solo career. The Eric Clapton soloing is great. I actually find the very simple piano at the beginning to be the most memorable part of the song. I think it's partly because I heard the acoustic version on the Love album first, where it's just George and acoustic guitar and then eventually a violin. So the raucousness of both Clapton's guitar and that piano, it's just a real pleasant surprise. As for the meaning of the song, there's not too much of it, but broadly, George, as you know, is interested in Hinduism and possibly other parts of Eastern philosophy, including I Ching. And one theme he saw in this is the idea that everything can be connected. So the idea of a broom sweeping, having some deeper meaning in the world. Whereas in Western philosophy, speaking broadly, he found that, you know, if there wasn't a very obvious connection between things, we don't touch on it. So kind of like the themes Sting touched on in his Synchronicity and the Police's Synchronicity album I talked about a few videos ago. So the album had a very good opening run for me. Then we get to something that I think starts to be a bit slow and awkward, and it's Happiness Is a Warm Gun. It's, you know, John playing something with a fairly calm acoustic backing, and it's a weird mixture of lyrics. Interesting weird, to be fair. He says, she's a well acquainted with the touch of the velvet hand, like a lizard on a window pane. Then he's sort of playing with expressions, Mother Superior jumped the gun. But then he gets to the chorus, which is absolutely beautiful, which is a nice contrast, especially considering the shocking subject matter. Happiness is a warm gun. So I was drawn to this one, in addition to the beauty and cartoonishness of bang, bang, shoot, shoot, by the fact that I assume this was inspired by a children's book I read when I was little about the Peanuts. Happiness is a warm puppy. However, that's like one layer back. John was inspired by an ad by the National Rifle Association, which in turn was sort of bastardizing the Charles Schulz phrase. So the NRA put out this unironic ad called Happiness is a Warm Gun, and John was like, well, wait a minute, a gun is warm if you've just shot it. That's not really something that should make you happy. So it's a beautifully ironic, wonderfully strange song, and I'm continuing to enjoy the album at this point after all. Next on the album comes Martha My Dear, which is, you know, a Paul song and very much one of his granny tunes. You know, there's simple piano playing at the beginning, and then strings come in and they synchronize exactly with Paul's voice. Now, eventually the song begins to get a bit complicated. It sort of mixes in some guitar, so it's sort of an old style song, sort of sounding a bit more modern. Now, as for the lyrics, there's not much there, but apparently Martha was Paul's sheepdog, so you could interpret it as a song sung to the dog, especially because there are a lot of references to Martha being a silly girl. Track 10 is I'm So Tired. The meaning in this one is quite literal, like you can hear tiredness in John's vocal delivery, and indeed it captured moments of frustration for him when he was in India. That said, it doesn't remain calm and tired. It has a kind of jazz pop feel, but then John's voice crescendos and then has the cracks in it one comes to expect of John. The one notable part of the lyric came when he curses Sir Walter Raleigh. I realized I don't really know who Walter Raleigh is. Apparently one of the things he did was bring tobacco to England, so I guess John's complaining about his addiction to cigarettes here. Track 11 is Blackbird. I mean, this is one everyone knows who's heard someone try to learn something a tiny bit complicated on guitar. It's a beautiful, simple acoustic guitar tune about a little bird learning to see and learning to fly. Though apparently because bird is used in England to mean girl or women, Paul kind of saw it as a subtle civil rights anthem. And then, more obscenely, Charles Manson saw it as a call for the black people to rise up and fight the white people, so then the white people could go fight race war with the black people. I did not dig deep into Charles Manson's conspiracies and why he was invested in these things, but yeah, apparently this very sweet song was a call in Charles Manson's mind for race war. The next song on the album, Piggies, also fit into Charles Manson's conspiracy. There's one line in there, "What they need's a damn good whacking," that I guess inspired Charles Manson's love for violence, but for me it just sounds like Monty Python Britishness, sort of like making fun of strict boarding schools. I mean, with reference to pigs, what you're obviously getting on is a commentary on social class and how the rich are eating the poor, with the reference to pigs eating bacon. The song has a nice rich harpsichord at the beginning, which shows good production, because the thing with harpsichord is the notes don't hold. They have a very sharp staccato sound, so well done there. Reading about this one, I saw that the folk singer Theodore Beatle did a cover of it, and he makes enough fun changes to it that I would recommend listening to that version too. So a good, innocent little moderate protest song. I wonder if this means that George is moving to the left from 2 years ago when he wrote the Taxman song. Track 13 is called Rocky Raccoon. I was really underwhelmed by this one, and apparently I was supposed to be. Apparently George Martin called this album filler. The reason I expected more of this is the very first Beatles CD I actually had was from my piano teacher, Rebecca Featherstone, back in the day. She made this album, which she called the second best Beatles mixtape ever. And she called it that because her friend had made the best Beatles mixtape ever. And Rocky Raccoon was one of the songs on it, and I didn't remember it, but I figured if it was on the second best mixtape better, it must be one of the better Beatles songs. But no, it just has a memorable title, and it's really just Paul McCartney improvising a sort of Western narrative. The only thing that surprised me about it is there are a bunch of names in the song, and there's a reference to a particular evangelical Bible, the Gideon's Bible, in there. So, maybe Paul was more inspired than he's let on, but as far as I know, this was just a light little improvisation, not the most important song on the record. Track 14 is performed and written by Ringo, though apparently at the time it was erroneously credited to Lennon-McCartney, because I guess the studio was too used to, whatever the 60s equivalent of copying and pasting is. On the one hand, it's Ringo, so it's a kind of goofy country song, but it sounds lively compared to some of the things we've been hearing in the second half of this first disc of this double album. It's both simple and slightly chaotic, so not the most memorable, but a pretty good song. It's glad to finally hear Ringo doing some songwriting, and it was a winner in my books. Track number 15, Why Don't We Do It in the Road? I'm starting to think at this point, guys, just stop recording new songs. Like this one, they're all fine. It's just, not all of them are nearly as fun as Oobla Dee Oobla Da or as beautiful as My Guitar Gently Weeps. It's okay to do a shorter album, and this is just Paul showing off that he can sing in quite a deep voice and singing a kind of raunchy blues song inspired by the fact that he saw some monkeys making love in the road and being like, why do monkeys get to be all inappropriate and people don't? Track number 16 is called I Will. It has some very soft singing from Paul this time, in contrast to Why Don't We Do It in the Road. Nothing really memorable going on here, but there's some harmonizing in the bridge that really makes it sound like an Everly Brothers song. Finally, we get to track 17, the end of disc 1. This one is called Julia, and it opens, rather bluntly with John singing, "Half of what I say is meaningless." So this is a song named after John's mother, who was killed by a driver who couldn't see her when John was 17. The lyrics were a bit weird because they didn't feel like they were about a mother, and apparently some of them are about Yoko. There's a reference to Ocean Child, which is an English translation of Yoko Ono's name, or an approximate translation. So I guess the thing is, John's mother was in and out of his life. When she and his father separated, he just went and lived with her sister because for some reason his mother couldn't take care of him and she remarried someone else, so I guess didn't want to live with John. So he's trying to write a song about this person, but maybe realizing he didn't know her as well as he wanted to. So it's sort of a song about Julia, sort of a song about Yoko. Disc 2 starts with a song that I'm both thinking, okay guys, wrap it up, but eventually I start thinking, okay, this is pretty cool. So the song is called Birthday, and at first it just sounds like one of those restaurants that because Happy Birthday is copyrighted or was copyrighted, they have to make their less good song that they sing to you when they bring a cake to your table on your birthday, but eventually it builds into something pretty cool. This surf rock meets hard rock, wall of sound kind of thing. And, it's a very fragile whole. If you take out any of the parts, it would be a really underwhelming song. But, all put together, it's quite nice. Track 2 feels like a similar thing, but with more of a John flavor. It's a sort of a very simple song in some ways, but there's just so much commitment to it. It's called Your Blues, and it's just sort of John screaming about how sometimes he wants to die. And, yeah, just very angry, raw blues. Track number 3 on the second record is Mother's Nature's Son. It's folk with soft orchestral instrumentation. I think Paul's voice is just a bit too soft here to work for me, but it sort of sounds like a predecessor for John Denver music. And I believe John Denver, who either is just about to come or has just emerged on the scene, would cover Mother Nature's song, because he did a lot of covers early in his career. So, even if this song doesn't quite work out for me, it sort of sets a precedent for a great singer in John Denver who would show up shortly thereafter. Track 4, Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey. It kind of reminds me of the Rolling Stones song, The Monkey Man. This one, is a tiny bit more melodic, a tiny bit less screamy than the Rolling Stones, but not much. It's really just the difference between John doing a screamy song and Mick doing a screamy song. Supposedly, this could be some reference to some of John's darker drug habits, but if it is, it's quite indirect. Track 5, another John-led number. It's called Sexy Sadie, and it opens with the question, what has she done? But of course, there's some softening Beatles la-la-las. So supposedly, this was a very angry song that John wrote about the spiritual leader that they had all been seeing, but George really liked more than the others, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. There was some sense that he might have made an inappropriate advance on Mia Farrow, who was also at the site, but it could also just be that John was starting to see through religious BS and said, you're a BS artist. But it's also one where if you just listen to the song, it doesn't sound so unequivocally negative. I guess because the name is Sexy Sadie, you think it's about a woman, and it sounds more like John's being ambivalent about someone who's just very open with her sexuality. Does he think that's cool, or does he think that's annoying? But if you know the meaning, supposedly it's just a negative song. Track 6 on the second record, Helter Skelter. So this song is described as giving birth to the metal genre. Paul, the singer of nice granny songs, is, singing before some very loud music. It's mostly just about style. He's evoking the idea of going on a roller coaster or some other kind of amusement park experience. And again, this one really inspired Charles Manson because, Charles Manson, kooky guy. Track number 7 is called Long, Long, Long. It's a George Harrison song, again, doesn't do much for me at this point. I can't blame George for wanting it on there because obviously most of the songs are Lennon and McCartney, and George is really starting to see himself as a full-fledged songwriter. at this point, you know, it might be a beautiful song on a shorter album, and there's some ominous wind mixing at the end of the song. So yeah, nothing bad, just didn't really have anything to write about on this one. Track number 8 on disc 2, we have Revolution 1. So I'd heard the version on the Love album, which sounded bluesier. This one, it kind of caught me off guard because this take was very mellow, very hippie, kind of sound like it was stoned out, especially with the backing vocals, shooby-dooby-doo-wah. But the message here is essentially that John agrees with a lot of left-wing politics, but he's a pacifist, so he's not exactly down with the Maoists and broadly anyone who's really talking about literal revolution. But what I think is important in determining, for political reasons, if you're going to like this song or not, is there were different takes, supposedly, and on some of them, John says all the time, count me out, but there are versions where he actually says the end, count me in, as if saying, look, I am a pacifist, I'm not comfortable with all this violent stuff, but I hear your point, and, you know, socialism is cool, and war sucks, and capitalism sucks, so maybe I do have to give you guys kind of a more of a chance and not just judge you because you seem violent on a peripheral level. So I appreciate that nuance in the writing of this song. So apparently I'd misunderstood, and it's not that there's a different version where he says count me in, rather he says count me out and then corrects himself and says in, and it's in this version, but it's so confusing that I missed it. So yeah, it is on the White Album version. You can hear him say count me out and then says in awkwardly after that, but still the same analysis applies. Even as a listen, it was a bit too mellow, and I don't know, even though I also consider myself a pacifist, I'm not sure I would write a song so unequivocally putting down activists as that one. Track number 9, another of Paul's granny songs. It's called Honey Pie. I don't know, the melody didn't really stick with me, but there was one part where I swore the novelty singer Tiny Tim, who you might know from the pilot episode of SpongeBob SquarePants, singing. So I think it's just Paul singing in this ridiculous falsetto, and if you know Tiny Tim, you know what I mean. Now we get to track 10, which is not a great song, but a solid song, an interesting one. It's called Savoy Truffle. It's a George composition. It has minimal lyrics. It's largely him listing fruity dessert items, but it's just such a big sound in introducing a baritone sax, an instrument you would go on to hear in some of George's solo songs. So, I don't know, it's a kind of a poor man's I Am the Walrus, but again, so rich and quirky enough in its own right. It's enough of a joy to listen to. I actually heard this one for the first time sung by Ella Fitzgerald on a collection called Black America Sings Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison. So the idea that the first lady of song herself would pick this one, I mean, makes it just all the more memorable and pretty cool in my book. Track 11 on record 2, Cry Baby Cry. I don't know, it's a slightly upbeat, melancholy pop song performed by John. It kind of reminds me a bit of A Day in the Life without the epic double parts, though you do get a tiny bit of Paul singing this intriguing, mellow little folk bit at the end, Brother, Can You Take Me Back? But it's such a swift idea, I guess it doesn't really rise into greatness. But I don't know, there's something surprisingly cool about and haunting about that little Paul bit at the end of this track. Track 12, we get this thing that gets parodied most on this record, Revolution 9. It's, you know, just a guy saying number 9 a bunch of times, and then there's pauses for various sound effects and, you know, various bits of dialogue. And, you know, I like the idea of going this avant-garde. I just think it's a shame to bury it right at the end of a double album like this, because at this point you've kind of been taken out of it. You're kind of fatigued by all the songs. Whereas I think Revolution 9 might be effective if you say you make it track 2 of the record, you put it right after Back in the USSR, because then you're forcing the person to be uncomfortable rather than gradually mellowed in that direction. And then finally you get to track 13, which is Goodnight. I mean, the predominant thing here is George Martin's string arrangement, and then you have Ringo singing, but I mean, you barely notice the song. It's really just beautiful strings. So overall, I guess how you assess the White Album depends. Do you just say, well, an album is really just a collection of songs and there are so many good to great songs on here? Or do you look at it as a whole piece of art and think, okay, it kind of starts to go a bit downhill. And a lot of these songs would have been better if maybe they spread them out over different albums. I mean, that's really just a matter of personal philosophy. As I say with a lot of double albums, I think it would probably be stronger if maybe you cut the track list in half. So let's see, what would I do? Maybe Back in the USSR, then straight to Revolution number 9, Dear Prudence, Glass Onion, Obla Di Obla Da. Yeah, I guess I do. Wild Honey Pie, Continuing Story, Bungalow Bill, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and then Happiness is a Warm Gun. So now I'm at 9 songs, and now I have to start cutting mercilessly. So then maybe Blackbird, Piggies. I guess we have to skip Don't Pass Me By, Sorry Ringo, Helter Skelter, Savoy Truffle, and Goodnight. Yeah, I guess that would be the concise version of the White Album. Kind of did that off the cuff. There's not a great way to do it, because the problem is I like a lot of what's here. I think it just adds up to a bit too much. And the trajectory of the album, it's kind of starts with the Beatles in their LSD mode, and then they just gradually go down into their weed mode. And, you know, I don't do either drug, so I can't really speak to what they're like, but just it becomes sort of slower and mellower, and yeah, man, that's nice. So that's the kind of vibe I get by the end of it. But overall, glad to discover a lot more cool Beatles music, and look forward to checking out Abbey Road next. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.